Well, it was a dramatic revelation. Yesterday, the Trudeau government released figures that show that over the past 10 years, 20 convicted child murderers have been transferred from prisons to lower security healing lodges in Canada. The revelation comes after weeks of angry debate in the House of Commons over the transfer of convicted child killer Terri-Lynne to a correctional services healing lodge in Saskatchewan. The government last week announced a change in correctional services policy to end such transfers, and Terri-Lynne has been transferred back to a prison in Edmonton. But the figures released by a parliamentary secretary yesterday have reignited a very emotional and often angry debate. Joining me now is Latimer. She's the Executive Director of the John Howard Society of Canada, and that's a charitable organization dedicated to evidence-based, humane responses to crime. Ms. Latimer, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Martin.
Okay, first of all, coming from where you come from, because obviously the John Howard and the Elizabeth Fry Societies work with people in our institutions. But coming from where you come from, when you heard that figure and you heard that headline yesterday of 20 people convicted of killing minors, serving time in healing lodges, what was your reaction?
I think one is always dismayed when we hear about the deaths of minors and the people who perpetrate them. But that doesn't take away from the notion that it is the obligation of the correctional services to attempt to rehabilitate those who have committed heinous crimes. And to the extent that Indigenous healing lodges actually help in that rehabilitative process, I think it's a good thing that those who would benefit from that experience are being exposed to it.
You know the system, and you've been around the system, and you've been inside the system. What's behind the transfer to a healing lodge?
The transfer to a healing lodge would take place as part of a correctional trajectory. So there would be a determination made that participation in a healing lodge and following Indigenous practices would be of benefit to the individual in terms of supporting their successful rehabilitation and reintegration.
When you watch the case of Terri-Lynne, a woman from Southern Ontario, one of the questions that was asked was if the healing lodge is part of Indigenous culture and if it was instrumental in helping Indigenous offenders deal with the particular challenges they may have and reinsert into society, why was a non-Indigenous, or why are non-Indigenous men and women using the healing lodge?
The healing lodges are available to non-Indigenous people as well, if they are of the view and commit to pursuing Indigenous practices. What you'll find is that a lot of people who end up in the correctional system suffer from the same kinds of trauma, abusive childhoods, and all kinds of things that the healing lodges are particularly good at addressing. So there are some real benefits for people being exposed to the healing lodges.
When you hear the public outcry, because there was a lot of anger when people hear well, back up a bit. Of the 20 people we have now seen in this headline as being transferred, they're described as child killers, they've been transferred to healing lodges. What do we know about those 20 people? Do we know anything about those cases of the 20 people?
I don't know anything about those cases, and they could be a lot more complex than merely killing minors. There's lots of, for example, if the perpetrator was a youth themselves and aged into the adult system, okay, and so they could have been killing someone of relatively the same age, still a tragedy, but less so than seeing the victim as entirely vulnerable to an adult perpetrator.
So these, for example, this could include people who are like 14, 15, 16, kill another minor, because all we know of this is people who've killed minors under 18,
right,
killed another person under 18, and then aged out of the system, and then gone into the adult system because they're still serving their sentence, and then being transferred to the healing lodge.
Sure, and it could involve a lot of gang violence as well. I mean, a lot of people who sign up to gangs can be fairly young. And they may get caught in the crossfires and end up dying.
What about the fairly horrific and tragic thing of infanticide? Mothers who kill their babies, would they be classed as baby killers?
They would be, I assume, in this categorization. And
so
that's often a lot of mental health issues that are affecting a person at that stage.
When you saw the anger, though, at people hearing that someone in Terri-Lynne case, for example, has been transferred to this lodge, a lodge with no fences, with access even of families bringing children to visit, and they're only a few years into their sentence, maybe 8 or 9 years, 7 or 8 years into their sentence, and they're now serving in these facilities. What do you say to Canadians who are angry and say that this is a miscarriage of justice?
You raise a very good point. A lot of people don't understand sort of the trajectory of what the Correctional Services is hoping to achieve by rehabilitating and by supporting the rehabilitation of individuals. So they would have made a very calculated decision about whether or not this constituted some sort of undue risk to others by transferring this person into a healing lodge. And if they felt it was unduly risky, they wouldn't have done it. 8 or 9 years in a life sentence is a fairly long period. One of the concerns that many of us have is that far too many people who are serving life sentences or long periods without parole ineligibility are warehoused, and that makes it more difficult when you're starting to look at their rehabilitation and reintegration. I think people are angry because they don't understand the sort of multiple purpose that Correctional Services is supposed to be providing. The penalty, the punishment, is actually imposed by the courts in the sentence. The CSC is to carry out the sentence in a way that provides some measure of security, but they're also required to support the rehabilitation of people who.
What about when someone says, though, I mean, do the crime, serve the time? The most heinous crime, and most people can conceive of, is killing an 8-year-old baby, or an 8-year-old young girl like Terri Stafford. And why the devil would you not be serving long time in the hardest conditions for that?
It is a horrific crime, and it's bound to evoke some sort of emotional response. But you really need to look at the perpetrator. And I think anybody who has lost someone to a horrific crime like murder will have a visceral reaction and think that the person who committed that should be subjected to a very harsh regime. The difficulty is that if you're doing that, you're not rehabilitating them and supporting them. The penalty is what the courts impose. It is not up to Correctional Services to repunish people by denying them opportunities.
2 questions then. One, the government has announced new criteria. Ralph Goodale, Minister, last week announced new criteria by which they seem to suggest that this will not happen in the future, that you will not have people guilty of these serious crimes ever ending up in healing facilities. Your reaction and your interpretation of what
I think that would be terrible. I think that what you find is that the prisoners with the lowest recidivism rates tend to be murderers. They tend to be a very stable influence in a prison population, and they're very amenable to rehabilitation and reintegration. So to deny them an opportunity because of the seriousness of their original offense denies them the capacity or the recognition that people can in fact change.
As you watch the way this whole issue has evolved, especially watching this place that we watch, Parliament Hill, over the last few weeks, almost more than a month, your reaction to how this whole thing is played out in the public?
I think you get into real trouble when there's a politicization around decisions in the correction system. You have to rely on people with an arm's length distance from the victims who are really looking at the correctional criteria who make those decisions. I think it's very destabilizing and unfair in a justice system if it gets caught up in that old saw about whether people are tough on crime and soft on crime. In effect, if you're successfully rehabilitating someone, you're promoting community safety.
Okay, Ms. Latimer, thank you very much for coming in. Thanks for
My
sharing
pleasure.
your experience.
Thank you, Martin.